All right. I hope we are recording. So good afternoon. Good afternoon from Belgium because, Antwerp is in Belgium and it's pouring rain as we just established. Thank you for joining for this particular ICONS Committee on New Directions New Scholarship Showcase. As you already know, this is a series of monthly virtual events that is dedicated to new books in public law. My name is Maya. I am the co-chair of the Committee on New Directions, and Rehan, my colleague, who is also the co-chair, is here as well. Also, as you know, the New Scholarship Showcase is the ICONS flagship, but it is also co-sponsored by our centers. For example, the Center for Comparative and Transnational Law from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, also from the Center for Political and Constitutional Studies in Madrid, where our colleague Adai is affiliated, and of course, the Montaigne Center for Rule of Law and Administration of Justice, where I am affiliated at the Utrecht University. More about the event today. The event is featuring for the first time the edited volume. So far, we've had preference sort of to say for monographs, but we decided to expand our interest to edited volumes because we realized we were missing a little bit. And so the discussion today will be about the book titled Federalism and Constitutional Law, the Italian Contribution to Comparative Regionalism, published by Routledge in 2021, edited by three dear colleagues of mine, Erika Arban, who is affiliated with University of Melbourne as an affiliated scholar and postdoc, Professor Giuseppe Martinico from Sant'Anna in Pisa, in Italy, and Professor Francesco Palermo from the University of Verona, but also he's the head of the Institute of Federalism at URAC. Apart from that, we also have two distinguished scholars who are not from Europe, and these are the Professor Asha Sarangi from Jawaharlal Nehru University in India, and Professor Marcelo Labanca from the Catholic University in Pernambuco in Brazil, who will act as discussants during today's event. The authors will certainly tell you more about the book. We will discuss it a little bit later. For now, I want to tell you that my 5 minutes as a chair's introduction and brief biography of the speakers is gone. Now I will invite authors to introduce the book, let's say for 20 or 15 minutes, no longer than that. And then we will hear the comments from Asha and Marcelo for 10 minutes each. Then after that, we would hear the responses from the authors, let's say 10 or 15 minutes, and then we can continue with the Q&A with the audience. Of course, if there are comments, other comments from Asha and Marcelo, they can still intervene after that. If the audience has questions, they can put them in chat. That is also okay. Or they can wait until the very end, and then they can ask the questions. But at this point, I will ask the authors to present the edited volume of the book. The floor is yours.
So I will start. So good afternoon, everyone from Milan. And first of all, let me express my gratitude to Maya, to Rehan, to ICONS New Directions, to all the organizers of this webinar for giving us the opportunity to participate and present this book. It is, of course, a great privilege to be here. And I would also like to thank Asha and Marcelo for engaging with our work. I look so much forward to your comments and feedback later. So what I would like to do in the next 5 minutes or so is to briefly explain how this book, we decided to write basically this book, the core ideas behind this book. So it was I think the end of 2019, and Giuseppe, Francesco, and I, we were all here in Milan at a Comparative Constitutional Law conference. And we basically realized how little was known outside of Italian borders about the Italian regional model, about the Title Fifth of the Constitution, which was reformed in 2001, which is the core, the essence of Italian regionalism. And since 2021 marked the 20th anniversary of the reform of Title Fifth, we thought that this was an excellent, a perfect opportunity to publish something in English and make it available to a broader audience. And so we invited a group of friends, colleagues, Italian, but also non-Italians. And so in the various chapters of this book, we tried to analyze in detail what we thought were and are the core aspects of Title Fifth and the reform. And we decided to do so by taking a comparative approach, meaning that we try to situate the Italian regional experience within a broader comparative debate on federalism. So we try to showcase which aspects of the Italian regional model could be of interest for a global readership, in light of the fact that many of the debates that have animated the political, the constitutional discussions in Italy before, during, and after this reform bear similarities, commonalities to other discussions, similar discussions in other decentralized systems. But this 20th anniversary of the reform of Title Fifth was also an opportunity for us to critically assess the changes that this reform brought to the Italian constitutional system, to reflect on the present state of Italian regionalism, why further decentralization has been resisted. Of course, as soon as we started working on this book, the pandemic hit, and this, of course, created some tensions within Italian regionalism, as was the case also with other multi-level systems. So Italian regionalism has been changed or put into question by the pandemic. Why was this reform of Title Fifth so important to deserve a book dedicated to it? Well, there are at least a couple of reasons for this. The reform rewrote, reshaped completely the division of powers between the central government and the regions, but it also introduced into the Italian constitutional text a number of features, of new features that we thought are quite unique to the Italian system, but are also of relevance for a comparative debate. I would just mention the introduction or entrenchment of horizontal and vertical subsidiarity, the entrenchment of differential regionalism, metropolitan cities, and so forth. And we can talk about this later during the discussion. The main message or messages that have emerged from our analysis, and so the core messages of the book can be summarized as follows. So we think that the 2001 reform had a great federalist potential. It was thought at the time that it was the first step towards a further, more substantive federalization of Italy, but these expectations have remained unsatisfied. Federalism has lost momentum in Italy, and we think that one of the reasons that explain this is the lack of a real strong federalist or autonomist culture in Italy, or at least the lack of this culture in some parts of the country, because some regions have, the contrary, a strong autonomist vocation. Also, this reflects the long-standing skepticism towards federalism that has characterized most of the Italian constitutional history. The book, and I conclude here, is also an opportunity, as the title suggests, to engage in the discussion whether there is a difference and whether it makes sense to differentiate federalism from regionalism. And again, this can be a topic for discussion later. So I stop here and I hand it over to my colleagues.
Thank you, Erika. Hello, everyone. Thanks indeed to the organizers, in particular Maya and Rehan. Thanks to the icons, new direction. It is a great honor. It means a lot to us. And thanks also to the discussants. I'm sure that we will benefit enormously from your questions and comments. As Erika said, I'm gonna offer, let's say, an overview of the chapters of the book. But let me start by saying that we really led a terrific group of scholars, and coordinating them was a privilege and a very easy task, can I say. So what I'm gonna do is trying to mention all the authors who joined us in this venture. In chapter 1, Erika Arban retraced the intellectual history of Italian regionalism, starting from the Italian unification and paying particular attention to the debates on the regional form of government within the Constituent Assembly and the evolution of regionalism over the last decades. Indeed, as she pointed out, there was no shortage of references to comparative law in the works of the Constituent Assembly, and that's why we decided to bring Italy to the table of comparative federalism, so to say. In chapter 2, Cristina Fasone and Giovanni Piccirilli looked at how the form of government has changed in Italian regions over the last 20 years and the consequences for democratic accountability. In so doing, they also frame the constitutional reform of 1999, the one on the direct elections of regional presidents, in the broader season of institutional reforms that later led to the 2001 constitutional reform. In chapter 3, Giacomo Delle Donne analyzed the role of constitutional adjudication in the evolution of the Italian regional state. Indeed, the case law of the Italian Constitutional Court has contributed to making the system more functional. In chapter 4, Eleonora Ceccherini explored intergovernmental relations in Italy, focusing on horizontal and vertical forms of cooperation. In chapter 5, Alice Valdesalici focused on the impact of the 2001 constitutional reform on the financial constitution and its subsequent implementation through national legislation. In chapter 6, Alex Wilson discussed party system in Italy. The creation of regional governments in the ordinary regions meant that the Italian parties had to adapt their organization to serve this new political level. And in this chapter, Alex, of course, focused on the Lega Nord, which is one of the most interesting subjects in this respect. In chapter 7, Antonio Baraggia critically examined the evolution of the role of Italian regions within the European Union. In chapter 8, Francesco Palermo illustrated the multi-dimensional asymmetry characterizing Italian regionalism, also exploring the contribution of Italian asymmetric design to the development of federalism and regionalism worldwide. In chapter 9, Eric Longo addressed the Italian experience and its comparative relevance with regard to local governance and metropolitan cities. In chapter 10, Jens Wölk explored the principle of loyal cooperation in Italy and beyond. Indeed, all the chapters have a strong comparative flavor. This is not all the book about Italy, as you probably realize it. In my own chapter, I dealt with the principle of subsidiarity and its mutation within the Italian constitutional system, paying attention to how the Italian Constitutional Court has made use of subsidiarity to reshape Italian regionalism. And finally, in the last chapter, Eva Maria Belser touched upon those aspects of Italian regionalism which are interesting and even inspiring from a comparative perspective. By looking at Italy, Eva Maria Belser tried to address the question of how to define regionalism. And their point was that probably regionalism shouldn't be treated as the younger brother of federalism. It's much more. It is a model that has a lot to offer to both unitary and federal states. That's all. Let me conclude that for me, editing this volume with Erika and Francesco was a dream come true. I learned a lot. And thanks indeed. Then I'll pass on to Francesco. Thank you very much.
Thank you all also from me, and thanks to the organizers, the discussants, and everyone. Let me add just an additional but not casual reason for us three realizing this mutual dream of working together and editing together a book. I think it's really not by chance that the three of us all come from special regions. Very different ones, but we have certainly more awareness of the importance of regional differentiation than many other colleagues in Italy have. Well, I think the main elements have already been mentioned by my co-editors. So let me just add only one, also for the sake of saving time and leaving more time to the discussants who are going to say something that is certainly more interesting to me than what I have to say. Just one element, the comparative approach. So not only, of course, Italy is a relatively less known case in the comparative federal regional literature, but also we wanted to stress very much this comparative analysis. And why that? Because many countries in recent times, especially in the global south, but I would say not only, are in some process of considering different forms of federalization, regionalization, decentralization. I don't want to go into the theoretical debate about the distinctions between these terms, but you know, the phenomenon is pretty much the same. And we realize that actually in most of these countries, the debate is very close to the debate that has originated in Italy at the time of the invention of the regions and also later on with the evolution of the regional system. So there is in Italy, like in these countries, not much constitutional tradition of federalism, but there is a very strong historical, cultural tradition of differentiation among the different regions of the countries. Plus, also in Italy, like it is the case in all of these devolutionary countries, the reason for establishing a regional model and possibly a symmetric regional model is to solve contextual problems. So there is no big systematic reason behind that. It is to accommodate some issues, especially connected with either geographical remoteness or cultural difference, minority protection, etc. So we really think that having a closer look at the Italian experience might be extremely beneficial for these countries to look at how the regional issue has evolved in Italy, what are the pros and the cons, and what can be considered and taken into account when thinking of changing their territorial setting. So that's one of the main motives behind the book. So having said that, I think we can have a discussion with our discussants and benefit from their comments. Thank you so much again.
Yeah, thank you, all three of you, Erika, Giuseppe, and Francesco. And I have to admit, yeah, when I was reading the book, I really liked the fact that the book was actually divided in two parts. And the first part was actually about Italy. It was about the Italian context. And the second part was exactly about what you just mentioned, about using the Italian, or offering to use the Italian context in a comparative perspective. So, and I think that there was something about the global debate, or using the Italian case in the global debate. And so on that note, I hand it over to Professor Asha Saranki to offer her own perspective on the book as a discussant. You are muted.
Okay. Thank you, Maya, and thank you all the organizers for hosting this wonderful event and giving me an opportunity to say a few words within the limited time about this fantastic volume. And in particular, I would like to thank Francesco, who actually invited me, among others, organizers. I must say at the very outset that this is a very timely volume, and it makes very strong intervention, not just in case of comparative federalism as a field, but also, as Francesca just said, in terms of the understanding of federalism, both substantively and also in terms of the practices of federalism as a form of government around the world. And I read this book major parts of this book with great interest. So I'm really privileged to be here and to share my thoughts with all of you. I would like to say at the very outset that the volume is so well knit and so well structured that both the parts speak to each other. And not only the language very lucid, but it's also very convincing, which sometimes the academic writings fail to do. So I congratulate the editors for taking into account the minutest of details in writing this book. At the very outset, actually, one is intrigued about the substantive ways and historical processes and the manner in which the 2001 constitutional amendment about federalism that all of you have spoken about, which actually heralds some of the fundamental issues which are facing the world right now. And when I was reading this book, I was sort of looking at the context of late 1990s and early 2000, when we are talking about the rise of the ideological shift worldwide. And also 20 years later, I think it's absolutely essential that we go back to some of the debates that this book has raised, because we are passing through globally in a very interesting time with the rise of authoritarianism, far right, and the entire structure of governance coming under new sort of changes. So I think the volume does justice to that, not just in terms of the Italian federalism or comparative federalism structure within which the book is situated, but also globally. It has many lessons that one can take from it after reading the volume. So having said that, I would like to, I don't have to summarize the book because everybody knows what this book is about, but maybe I can flash out few of the important aspects that I gathered after reading chapters like chapter 1 and 4, 8, 9, as well as introduction and conclusion. Sorry, I wasn't able to read all the chapters, but I think I got the sense by reading these and flipping through other chapters very quickly. One of the things is that Italian federalism, I wish Indian federalism had also looked at Italian federalism, because when India was debating about the form of government, interesting thing is 1948 is also the time when we were writing our constitution. Our own constituent assembly was sitting to decide about the constitution, and we borrowed the federalist structure from many countries, obviously primarily from UK, that we were colonized by for 200 plus years, but also countries like Canada, Australia, Ireland, and so on and so forth. I wish we had also looked to Italy or Italian form of government, but you were also debating 1948. So it's a very interesting historical context. And when I was reading the book, I was thinking, at least I haven't come across, maybe there are some writings, Francesca and others will know, that there is so much of a contextual similarity, both historically as well as pragmatically, in the manner in which federalism has unfolded in both the countries. I'll come to that later on. I don't want to start with the India as a case, because I'm from India. But thing that I really found extremely thought-provoking and extremely unique is the idea of regionalism. Generally, when we use the word regionalism, whether in the literature of comparative politics or any other kind of branch of political science on the discipline, we tend to look at the idea of regions as somewhat, deviating from a certain kind of a uniform idea of an entity within the federalist structure. For example, in case of India, we define the idea of regions administratively, but also geographically. And I think the book also very significantly reminds once again that the term region, the regions, the 20 regions that the book is talking about, and therefore the idea of regionalism is much more complicated. It is not just about the geographical or topographical spread of a particular place or inhabitation of it by a particular kind of ethno-linguistic community, but also in terms of its distinctiveness. And how does a federal government or a federalist structure actually brings together such a diversity, and Italy is no exception to it. Italy, in fact, we, just to share with you that we always teach the Italy as a case study when we teach Gramsci. And Gramsci is a great scholar for us, for Marxist and for subaltern historians. And we then understand how diverse and also how difficult North and South distinction has been in case of Italy. And that kind of a geographical dissimilarity exists in other parts as well. So this historical, geographical, cultural, ethno-linguistic context to define the idea of regions, multiple regions, and regionalism coming into a certain kind of a governmentality, in the form of a federalism, is a very difficult, complex, and yet very interesting way to actually unpack the asymmetrical relationships that federal structure actually indicates, whether in case of Italy, or you can also actually extend it and look at the global sort of structures of such a, asymmetrical power relationship. So that's another very important, I would say, aspect of this volume, which makes us think that federalism is not something, written in stone, but it also evolves on a day-to-day basis, because it is actually situated and practiced within the everyday practices of the government. So that's the second point I would like to make about it. I think the 20 years gap after 2001 and now 2020, 21, 22, when the book came out, is a very important time gap. 2 decades actually is a time when you can see whether the kind of new constitutional interventions taken, and therefore the whole idea of constitutional law, which I think is a very strong element and aspect in this volume, comes out clearly by the scholars, various scholars who have reflected upon it. Because most of the time when we talk about federalism as a structure, as a practice, we tend to look at it simply in terms of the distribution and division of power between two constituents, but the center and the state, or center and the units of the federal government. Like in case of India, we call it federalism is with a strong center and weak states, quasi-federalism, several terms that have come into coinage. But what we tend to forget is that there is a legal framework that the governments have to abide by, which is a juridical aspect which we tend to overlook. And I think in the volume very strongly argues about the constitutional law aspect of it. That constitution is not just about the rules and regulations, but there is also a legal framework that is over there to protect the constitution, therefore the rights of the people of a particular country. And that's where I think the democratic aspect of this volume comes out very strongly. I see the resonance of a public policy in this volume, even though I don't see that has been much talked about. I see the resonance of a certain kind of a public civil society emerging out of 2001 constitutional intervention. And therefore, I think the 20 years span and this volume do a good job to bring these new dimensions of the interaction between the state and civil society. I mean, there is much more to it than I'm saying. Maybe in the discussion we can talk about it. The question of autonomy, subsidiarity, and metropolitan sort of layers of government is also something that one is seeing around the world. For example, I can only speak from my own sort of location, that is India, where we have layers and layers of decentralization and the devolution of power, even though we have a very strong center. But this idea of a sort of compromise, a federal compromise, if you want to call it, an idea of not of a coercion, but a compromise, seems to work on an everyday basis when the regional units are defining themselves differently from time to time. For example, certain cities are under tremendous turmoil and change. Metropolitan cities, for example, the urbanization is taking new forms of civic engagement with the government and the central authority. All of this is impacting the way in which people are deciding the devolution of power as both a substantive issue as well as a practical issue. So there is this. And I think the whole idea of federalism, if one has to go back to the history, and this volume, many of the articles in this volume actually reflect on it. So therefore, this scholarly reflection on the idea of federalism, rooted in centralist mentality, and I think Italian case is one of the best to look at the way in which historical antecedents of fascism and centralization of authority going into federal restructuring of the politics and the society. And now again, with the rise of the right, we must be seeing certain changes in the society. So this long historical path itself is a model to look to, in my understanding. So let me, and also I think another important which came up just now in Maya and others' reflections, that the idea of political culture, federal political culture, which I think is a fantastic category to work with. Generally, when we talk about political culture, we look at certain cultural assemblages or symbolic practices of the politics, or certain ways in which the politics manifests itself culturally. But federal culture or federal political culture is something very different, which one we must make sense of. I have much more to say, but let me just leave few questions. Can I do that? And then come back if the time permits. I mean, it was really wonderful to read this volume. It's read so easily and comfortably. I just spent the entire day reading today these essays. The question of subnational constitutionalism is, I think, something which needs much more elaboration, in my view, than I find in the book. So maybe the editors can a little bit more about it. But my question is, first question is, when we talk about regions, I mean, you have talked about two types of regions. Um, so are there ways in which the regions are divided? What are the sort of markers of the division of these regions? Are they purely administrative, geographical, ethno-linguistic, cultural, or there are certain parameters which the government has used, which the central government uses to define these regions as they are defined broadly, and that you keep referring to in the volume? Second question is, which I think will help will help us understand Italian case, because you do remind us that the relationship between federalism and regionalism is a rather complex one. Whether there are special provisions for special regions, or all regions are treated uniformly on the same pedestal, because, for example, in case of India, Indian Constitution has a separate schedule, sixth schedule, which focuses on tribal regions and which promises certain particular protective rights to the people belonging to those regions, right? And also the affirmative action policy also sometimes gets determined and shaped by the backwardness of a region. So are there special provisions for certain regions, or are they all treated alike? My third question would be, if there are conflicts of any conflicts between among regions, or conflicts between center and the region here by units of the federal government, what are the conflict mechanisms, resolution mechanisms between the center and the state, but we can call it here by any other name. So center and the units, constituent units. Are there clearly laid out conflict resolution mechanisms that the constitutionally guaranteed? Or is it, the government in power that decides on the basis of the situation that arises how to resolve the conflict? Are there constitutionally mandated and written codes to resolve any conflictual situation between the center and the units? The fourth question would be about the role of the leadership, which I think is absolutely essential and very, very important. How does the leadership actually, how is the leadership important in case of Italy? Because Italy has made this, very dramatic shift from fascism to modern time of Italian sort of system, which is much more democratic. So what point of time, what kind of leadership has actually affected federalist structure in a way that the subsequent leadership had to address and take care of? For example, one can look at what is going on right now under the new leadership. So, I mean, the Meloni's rule and Brothers of Italy and so on and so forth. Isn't it that with certain kind of a leadership, there is more a propensity towards centralization of power? We see that in case of India these days. Under a specific regime, there is a specific way in which the centralization or decentralization of power happens because of the manner in which the ideological forces work in the governance of the country. So the new coalition that has emerged in Italy, which has an impact on Europe, how do you see Italy's position in terms of the European idea of federalism? Because Europe, let me just add, has always been seen, I mean, in case of India, we look up to Europe, and I think Francesco reminded us that there is a long history of democratization which has happened throughout Europe, and new countries like India and many other in the global south have had looked up to Europe for certain lessons in terms of the everyday mechanism of devolution of power. So we also have that history of a strong, sort of relationship with Europe. And Indian model of parliamentary sovereignty or parliamentary form of government actually has taken a lot from European model. So with like migration of the kind that we are seeing, with the rise of the new right, LGBTQ movement, and so many other political issues which are actually facing us on day-to-day basis and are calling into question some of the older policy and policy regimes, which again comes into the ambit of constitutional law or comparative constitutional law. In India, for example, we have been going through for the last few days, weeks, an intense debate on the same-sex marriage and what are the constitutional mechanisms. If there are none, then shouldn't the parliament now make some laws and provide them the equal status like heterosexual marriages? So I think that the issues of 21st century must be impacting the Italian form of federal structure in a very, very deep sense. And my final, maybe I can leave some questions for second round. Are there any visible forms of protest or dissonance emerging from the civil society, which actually deeply questions and interrogates the given federal structure from time to time? I mean, which has to be actually interwoven into the kind of regionalism and federalism, because that's something extremely, I think, thought-provoking in the volume, not just the differentiation, but also the, you can say, reciprocal relationship between regionalism and federalism. And if that is so, then how are the regional voices being amalgamated into federal form of government? I have a few more questions, but I don't want to take too much of time and don't want to deprive my another panelist from taking his time, so I can come back later on. But thank you so very much for giving me this tremendous opportunity to share my thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your insightful comments and of course for the questions. But I think it's the time to go to the second discussant, to Professor Marcelo Labanca. The floor is yours. 10 minutes, please.
Okay, let's do it in 10 minutes. Thank you very much, Maja. And I'm very glad to be here. And I would like to thank you very much for this possibility to be here discussing this book about the experience of federalism in Italy. That's a country that I really love. I lived in Italy for 1 year. Exactly 10 years ago, so I could know more or less how is the structure and how does it work there, the federalism or the regional state. Well, we all know how much this country, Italy, is a reference for everyone in different subjects, in art, culture, food, and also a central country in law. It's very interesting how many scholars deals with federalism in Italy. It's a country that it's not a federation, and it's curious because of this. So many journals, for example, about federalism. Here in Brazil, we have only one journal dedicated specifically in discussions about federalism. And when I began my research on federalism, when I was young, like I was at the faculty of law, Brazilian books of constitutional law always pointed to the Italian example of decentralization. It always been a reference for us. But the books of this is a little bit funny because the books of administrative law always pointed to the. Sorry, Asha, I think you are with your microphone open. Okay, thank you. I was saying that the books of administrative law have always done this more, the reference about Italian regions, more than the constitutional law books. and always with examples about territorial autarky, using the Italian case of regions with some autonomy, always guarded by the center. Well, this was in the 90s. I was 20 years old, and this was before the constitutional reform of 2001. This is important I want to highlight this, because after the reform, the design naturally changed, and I always thought that the reform slowed down the movement for Italy to transform itself into an effective federal state in reinforcement of federalist movement. And this book shows many questions about the practice of federalism in Italy since 1948 to nowadays. Well, because of this, I would like to congratulate the organizers and the authors of this book, which comes in a good time for scholars of federalism around the world, where I belong to. And I will not comment chapter by chapter, but I'm gonna try to give an overview of this work. And first of all, this is a book to be read from the beginning to the end. If you can, of course, read just a single chapter, you will lose, you can, of course, but you will lose the sense of unity of the book. If you all allow me a comparison, it's like a Pink Floyd phonographic work. It must be listened in its entirety. The band once went to court against the EMI that was selling isolated music tracks. Some of the band's albums, such as Dark Side of the Moon and Which You Will Hear and The Wall, they are conceptual works in which all songs are linked into the same theme. So listening to just one track is to lose the dimension of the work. The British court ordered to EMI to stop selling single music online outside of the context of the albums. And I think this book, it's a little bit like that. There is a logic that merges between and through the chapters. And this is not always, this not always exists in collective works, unfortunately. Unfortunately, this coherence, we don't see this coherence in every collective work, but we see in this work. And my suggestion is reading the complete work with beginning, middle, and end. And if any researcher, for example, of political parties wishes to read the Alex Wilson chapter that deals with this, with political parties, or if any researchers of asymmetries or constitutional courts or fiscal federalism wants to read the chapters of Palermo or Delle Donne or Valdesalici in isolation, they will certainly be able to consult their chapters, but they will not have the dimension of the unity of the work. And this is once again curious, because this brings the work to a metaphor of the very idea of federalism, unity and diversity. Just reading the total work, the union of the chapters will give the reader the exact notion of understanding of federalism in Italy, its institutes, and how intergovernmental relations works, and the diversity of these chapters must therefore be understood within the concept of the total work, of the uniqueness of the book. Well, the book managed to present several points that are classic to the federal discussions. It seems for me that the Italian dilemma is always the one related to federations or states that adopt federalism as the governing principle of political organizations and territorial decentralization. Knowing the exact measure between centralization and decentralization and what values they intend to maintain. This dilemma was at the beginning of the 1948 Constitution. what was the right measure of decentralization and centralization, the fear of disintegration, the country, and at the same time, the need to preserve unity. All questions related to the need to take place so many social, economic, linguistic, and cultural differences that you have in Italy. And there are fragments that exist in the Italian territory. Note that the asymmetrical regionalism is constitutionally recognized, and the autonomies were stated at the Article 5, at the fifth article, with reference to the unity and indivisibility, but at the same time, with the provision for autonomies and local government and self-government. And the discussion of federalism in Italy wasn't, this is another point that I want to highlight here, because always when we read books about federalism, we have like we are captured by the American discussion. And the book has no need to follow or make reference to the American model of coming together, or either the holding together with some countries that emerged from a progressive federalization, from a unitary state, for example. The Italian experience have its own dynamic process to maintain unity and diversity. And the book makes, in several passages, an analysis of this. And also, after the constitutional reform of 2001, indicating like a movement of empowerment of the regions. Italy, as a regional state from 1948, is certainly not the same on these days, notably after the constitutional reform, but this decentralization comes with more democracy. This is a question. If we have more decentralization in subnational level, in the regional parliaments, we will have necessarily more democracy. And the book provided some indications on whether there was indeed an empowerment of regional governments and their presidents, their subnational, the presidents of the regions after 20 years of constitutional reform. A presidential principle, for example, at the subnational level. However, the regional parliaments that could best guarantee at the regional level pluralism and protection of minorities maybe seems to be weakened. Some passage of the book caught my attention. In one of them, the reflection carried out on the discredit of the regional parliament, which is perhaps more a phenomenon of distrust of the parliament themselves in a world that increasingly comes to value the personification of power in the president or a prime minister, rather than a central regional issue or parliament issue. Another very important aspect was the role of the constitutional court. We have done a discussion about a court, and that can be an arbiter between powers and regions, and also can play a role beyond the protection of fundamental rights. Here, there's a false perception, I think so, that these courts in federal or quasi-federal systems have a dual function, guarantee of fundamental rights and guarantee of competences. I have insisted a lot on the fact that in countries with a constitutional division of competencies, any conflict of competence has a great potential to be a conflict of fundamental rights. The US Supreme Court, for example, faced in the beginning conflicts over jurisdictional issues involving, for example, interstate commerce, and in practice interfered with the authorization of child labor. More recently, issues of competence over the right to abortion comes in the background of a discussion about competencies, and so about federalism. So competencies and fundamental rights end up being almost the same discussion faced to the constitutional court. since the legislature of fundamental rights must be guided by rules of competence, mainly in the construction of the agenda of fundamental rights at the subnational level with the state Bill of Rights. There are so many other questions. Central institutions such as Senate form part of another element essential to federal or quasi-federal states. If you see, the federal states always have a second chamber. Italy also provided for a second chamber in the constitution. The problems about the functioning of a Senate as an institution that effectively represents regional interests is not just an Italian problem, but several other states, federal states, has the same. My experience here. The Senate has an structure that represents the states on an equal basis. In so many other cases, the Senate ends being one more element in the formation of the national law, based in political discussions, where prevails the political formations of supporting or not, or you are supporting or you're being opposition to the majority government. They don't play this role about representative, being a institution that has a representative of subnational entities. And another interesting detail about the book is that this is a I don't know if I can see that it's a critical one, but it's about the title of the book. The title, I think the content goes beyond its title, because the title put the federalism in the approach of the constitutional law only. Federalism and constitutional law, and I think the book gives more than this. I understand very well that the organizers with a legal background have defined the title as a federalism constitutional law, since the scope of interdisciplinarity that we have the studies and the research on federalism, both in terms of the groups of researchers involved from different areas, and we have different groups with different areas that studies federalism with different approaches and with different methodologies. But I have in the last two years mapping all the works here in Brazil of federalism that they've been published in books and in theses of PhDs, theses, and journals here in Brazil. And I see that we can say that we have maybe 4 perspectives of groups that studies federalism, in 4 perspectives. The first one will be the historical, with a more eclectic group of researchers that studies federalism from a historical perspective. And we have a group of researchers that studies, they are historians, they are jurists, they are political scientists, among others. But we have a second approach that is the legal one. And this legal one, it's made mainly by professors of constitutional law, focusing on fundamental rights and federative competence, courts, subnational constitutionalism. And then we have the third one with an approach mainly in political institutions. And we have a third group that comes with this third approach, that they are composed mainly by researchers formed by political scientists who study public policies and intergovernmental issues. And then we have the last one, and this last one, this fourth one at the end, we have the economic or fiscal federalism, formed by tax lawyers and tax professors. And not always these 4 groups, they dialogue between them. And what I found reading this book, is that it's curious because the book, this book organized by Erica, Francesco, and Giuseppe, manages to make a journey that addresses all these four issues, from the historical to the functioning in the institutions and the normative aspects of federalism, and also fiscal issues. Well, I don't think I have any more time, my 10 minutes, but I think these were the important aspects I wanted to highlight here. And commenting this book just in 10 minutes is a very difficult task. My congratulations to all the organizers and authors for this work. It's a really good job, good work, and many thanks for the excellent research on the Italian experience, which has always been a reference for the scholars in the area of federalism. Congratulations.
Thank you, Marcelo. This was a little bit, this was 10 minutes that were stretched to, let's say, 15 minutes, but okay. Now I invite the authors to maybe reply to some of the questions. I think Asha asked about the ways of divisions and the parameters that the government uses, about the special provisions for special regions, and the resolution mechanisms, and also the role of leadership. But I think also Marcelo mentioned, for example, the discussion around the constitutional court and so on. After you do that, there are very good questions asked by our colleague Esteban in the chat. So let's do first this, and then we deal with the question in the chat. And then I also invite the people that are present here, the colleagues that are present here, to maybe either put questions in the chat or afterwards raise their virtual hand and ask the question themselves. I don't know if you have a particular order of how you want to reply, or
you tell that, Maya. We didn't agree on that.
You didn't agree on that. Well, I don't know. Do you want to go the same order and say something? Reply. Maybe Erika can start, and then Giuseppe, and then you, Francesco. But let's try to keep it short.
Yeah, thank you so much, Asha and Marcelo, for your remarks. I don't know how much time I have available, and of course I can't address all the points that have been raised. If that's okay with you, I would like to say something in response to Asha's question about leadership and protests on the federalist structure, if I understood that correctly, because it's something that interests me particularly. So basically, at the level of civil society, and perhaps I don't know if Francesco and Giuseppe agree with me, but it goes back to what I was saying a little bit in the introduction. So we have some parts of the territory that have a much stronger autonomist vocation, and it is particularly the region where Francesco comes from, to a certain extent my region, and also to a certain extent Sicily, where Giuseppe is from. But then the great majority of regions, the great majority of other Italian regions do not have this autonomist or / federalist vocation, which means that often when the federalist reform was proposed and was discussed, it was very much resisted, also at the level of the population. And it was done particularly on the basis of solidarity. In other words, there was this fear that federalism would, by giving more powers to the region, would go against the spirit of solidarity that is considered basically one of the fundamental principles in Italy. And we saw that also quite recently in the discussion on asymmetric regionalism. So some regions now, like Veneto, like Lombardia, Emilia-Romagna, are moving towards obtaining more powers. So they are exploiting Article 116, third paragraph of the Constitution to become more autonomous. And there has been lots of resistance at political level and also at civil society level towards this move, although it is provided for in the Constitution. So especially each time there is a discussion on federalism, and this was particularly true in the late 90s, early 2000s, and recently with asymmetrical, differential regionalism, we see that there is some pushback on the part of some political leaders, but also at the level of civil society towards regionalism or stronger regionalism. So again, this shows the different perception towards autonomy that we have in Italy, and also in terms of political leadership. The political parties that have supported federalist / regionalist reforms have switched over time. So initially, in the aftermath of the Constitution, it was mainly the center-right Christian Democrats party that was more in favor of decentralization, and then it switched. The reform, actually, the 2001 reform was passed under a center left government, although it was the Northern League who was advocating for it. Right now, the Meloni government is promoting, so it's actually making possible for the three regions that I was mentioning before, Veneto, Lombardy, and Emilia-Romagna, to obtain and engage with a differential regionalism. So the point is that there has been a shift in the political support or political leadership towards regionalism. I know it's a very how can I say, a very superficial answer, but I hope it addresses some of your concerns. Just a couple of minutes, if I have the time, to address something that Marcelo was saying. I agree with you. One of the first points that you made, the Italian model, the uniqueness of the Italian model. The American model was not influential at all, I would say, at least in 1948, before unification. Of course, the American model was studied, but it didn't really influence the 1948 Constitution. It is unique. It borrows, or the discussions that happened within the Constitutional Assembly borrowed a little bit from experiences from other European federal systems, from Spain, from Germany, but it is a unique model, and I think this is the beauty also of federalism. Each country then follows its own path. And on the title of the book, well, the idea was actually to focus more on the constitutional aspects of regionalism, but of course, you can't avoid the fiscal aspects, the economic aspects of federalism are very important in Italy. They played a major role. It goes back to this idea of solidarity that I was mentioning before, so you can't really avoid talking about those. And but I guess I take it as a good thing that we were able to focus on the constitutional aspects, but also reflecting on the political, the historical, and the economic sides of regionalism. I stop here and I'll hand it over to Giuseppe Francesco.
Giuseppe, go ahead.
Okay, thanks indeed. Well, the point about the relationship between subnational constitutionalism and federalism is very interesting to me. I will say that traditionally, subnational constitutionalism has been treated as a sort of penumbra concept. You mentioned subnational the constitutionalism because in some context of federalism is a sort of F word. But actually, I think it is possible to find a distinction. I see subnational the constitutionalism when there is the possibility of giving an added value to the protection of fundamental rights, regardless of from a formal point of view, federal or regional constitutional structure. So in this sense, even in Italy, in theory, at least the regional fundamental charters, so-called the statuti, could indeed reach, why not? I mean, the protection of fundamental rights, even updating what is said at central level. So in this sense, I think that Italy can be seen as a lab for subnational constitutionalism. But I'm happy to discuss this further. As for contestation, as Erika said, regionalism has been under siege, especially during the pandemic. Many accused our regional state of actually acting in a non-efficient manner. And I think that this debate to open, paved the way for the current discussion about one of the fundamental challenges of federalism from a comparative perspective, namely, if asymmetry is for sure, that as Francesco has written so well, one of the pillars of contemporary federalism, the real challenge nowadays is how to make asymmetry sustainable. And I think that this leads us to the role of courts, but also to the role of political actors. I think that conflicts in federal and regional system are normal. They can serve as the engine, I mean, even to improve, I mean, sometimes the constitutional machinery. We tend too much, I mean, to focus only on courts. I mean, and while, I mean, courts cannot work if understood despite the isolation. That's why it's necessary always to provide the system also with the political fora. So this is my take on the different issues. I know I've been very quick, but I hope, I mean, there can be another round for discussion. Sorry.
Let me add a few things. Thanks for having already responded to some of the comments. Well, very briefly, Marcello, well, the title, Erika has been too kind and polite and diplomatic. The title was imposed on us by the publisher, and we wanted to have a different one exactly for the reasons that you were mentioning, but then, you know, you have to give in sometimes. And it's interesting that you point out the fact that there are many journals dealing with federal issues and regionalism. Probably it's true, there are more than in other countries, more than you would expect. At the same time, if you look at the geography of constitutional lawyers in Italy, well, that includes also political scientists for what matters. You see that this is not a very popular topic among scholars in the field. So it is a little of a niche subject, and many people prefer to, you know, study things that have nothing to do with regionalism, because there is little awareness. But you know, those who are active in this field are really active. Like, for example, it is interesting that would open another chapter for debates. The role of the Constitutional Court, as mentioned also by the others, is or has been initially that of sort of engine to develop the regions in the early days. But then after the reform in 2001, it has become increasingly, let's say, centralistic and interpreting the constitution against the claims of the regions. And nowadays, I was really shocked by, you know, if you take the cases you know, of conflicts between regions and state, it's about 90% of the cases the Constitutional Court dismisses the regional arguments and takes that of the central government. And that has also to do with the facts. I'm sorry, I know we are recorded, but the Constitutional Court tends to never have experts in regional law in them. I mean, it cannot be by chance. It is something that has always been seen with some degree of suspicion. And the last point I want to make, again, it links to the question by Asha, the protests by civil society. I would put it even more bluntly. The little protests that exist on that are against more regionalism, more regionalization. There has been recently a booklet that has become very popular against more decentralization and everyone oversimplifying and thinking that regionalism, as Erika said, regionalism equals differentiation or different treatment or unequal treatment, etc. But the fact is that actually in some other parts of the territory, like where I am from, this constant dismissal and neglection of the regional claims actually creates sort of I wouldn't say improves the secessionist movement, but it is like seen as a total non-understanding of what is at stake by the central government. So resentment on that can be on both sides, and it can become problematic. My take is that probably in the next decade, we're going to see some interesting and not necessarily positive developments on that. Then we will come back maybe to other issues and other points later in the discussion. Maybe very short criteria to define the territory of regions, right, Asha? Well, in some cases, there were geographical criteria that were pretty logical and obvious. In other cases, there were some historically grown regions, but in, I would say, most of the, or at least half of the cases, there was no particular reason for that, and there are regions that are completely artificially built, and you can see that also in the way they really play out, because they didn't develop a real strong regional identity.
Thank you all. I just want to refer to the question or the questions that were asked by Esteban, exactly for the reasons why the book was also written. And he mentions that both questions that he asked are in connection with those who are thinking about decentralization and multi-level constitutionalism in the global South, and especially using the Italian experience to that matter. I'm not sure if you've read the questions. Is there a need to read them all over again? Maybe for the recording reasons, I'm just going to try to sum them up. The questions are, how do you see the relationship between the regional form of government and the development of IGR nationally, and also the lack of a proper territorial chamber, for example? Do this form of government adds more fuel to the need of executive IGR, further increasing the accountability challenges introduced by executive IGR, and does it affect the national party system, and how? Quite a lot. And do you agree with the statement in the conclusions of the book that bilateralism in case of special regions augmenting parity between ordinary and special regions, as well as differences between the special regions themselves, while additionally affecting the rule of law, since the Constitutional Court seems to permit that consensus trumps Trump constitutionalism? So whichever order you want to take, we have, let's say, 10 minutes. If anyone wants to go first, otherwise we go with Erika, Giuseppe, and Francesco.
Erika has a train to catch, so she should start.
Okay.
Okay, sorry. Okay, thank you, Esteban, for your questions. Can I have the privilege of picking the question to ask on the proper, the lack of a proper territorial chamber, and how this affects the relationships between the central and the regional government. Of course, this is a long-standing debate. It's been discussed particularly recently. There was this reform that was proposed basically in 2016. It was part of a much bigger reform of the constitution, and this reform was actually aiming at introducing like this regional chamber, so reducing the number of senators, but making it possible for these senators to actually represent the regions. The reform didn't pass. It was rejected by referendum. So we're basically at the same point of departure. And this is why we have this system of conferences in place. These intergovernmental type of relations between the regions and the government to compensate for this lack of a territorial chamber. I guess we can debate whether a strong territorial chamber is needed for maintaining and preserving healthy relationships between the center and the periphery in a decentralized system. There are opinions in both senses. I guess the example of Canada is often brought as a federal system that doesn't really have a regional, traditionally federal upper chamber, but still is a system that helps actually maintaining a healthy federal relations between the central government and the provinces. So I guess there is. I don't have a clear answer on that. There are alternative forms to the second chamber that can be exploited in order to create this type of coordination between the center and the periphery. I don't know if I have addressed clearly your question.
Erika, thank you very much. I'm sorry, Giuseppe, if we do not see Erika anymore, thank you for joining us. Hopefully we'll see
I can say a few more minutes.
Okay, but in any case, thank you. Yeah, Giuseppe, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. No, I tend to agree with Erika. When I had another point, I think that as it also happens in other contexts, we have the confirmation, the fact that intergovernmental relations are an essential part of federalism. So, and in all the jurisdictions, at least in those I know, I always tend to see the same issue. So, I mean, intergovernmental relations are crucial, as they sometimes tend, and this happens in Canada as well, as they can, in a way, enrich the former constitution, even sometimes, I mean, creating a sort of parallel material constitution. But in all these contests, we always have issues in terms of accountability and transparency, and I think it is, I mean, a common issue that we sometimes also find in Italy. But this is, I would say, emanation of a broader the comparative trend, which characterizes our country regardless of the long-standing issue of the absence of a proper second chamber. So I tend to agree indeed with Erika, and I think that however, there is just one thing I'm not sure about, because when Esteban, I mean, correctly highlights the risk that the Constitutional Court can actually accept the system in which consensus trumps constitutionalism. I see the risk, but I don't think we are there. The thing that the Constitutional Court has tried at least, I mean, to raise some counter limits that in theory, I mean, could rescue, I mean, the role of the political players as well. But here again, I think that we need to understand that courts don't work in splendid isolation. So a robust regional or federal system, I mean, works if we also have robust political actors. And sometimes my feeling is that we tend to pay too much attention to the Constitutional Court, which can be accused for sure of having sometimes reshaped the system. I'm very critical about the case law of the Italian Constitutional Court about subsidiarity, but generally speaking, I think that the Constitutional Court is trying to preserve, I said, I mean, the untouchable core of the system. Thank you.
May I also say a couple of words? Thank you, Esteban. Great. Yeah. No, thank you, Esteban. Great questions indeed. So first, the executive IGR. Well, yes, sure. The trend is there and is there everywhere. That confirms in a way that a second chamber doesn't bring much to the debate, and actually second chambers are either executive, namely Germany, or countless, or just irrelevant. So first, yes, the interesting thing is that there is such a trend that promotes executive intergovernmental relations to the extent that now the presidential system that has been introduced in the regions of Italy, except two, is now influencing very much the national debate on, reforming the constitution in a presidential way. God save us, but that's what is gonna probably happening. So it seems that this has been valued as a positive experience, right? With all the pros and cons, but yes, that's what has happened. Like Giuseppe, I don't see the immediate reason why bilateralism should necessarily trump constitutionalism. At least I see the point, but at least as long as bilateralism is regulated by the constitution, is a constitutional procedure, so then there is nothing wrong with that. The problem with bilateralism is when it is entirely behind closed doors and there is no transparency, and it's just a political bargaining and outside of legal control. But as long as this is not the case, and again, the special regions have such mechanisms, that's good. And I think it is not by chance that the proposal for now differentiating among the ordinary regions, the process that is may be happening, who knows, but it is certainly in process, will copy precisely this model and introduce bilateral relations also between some ordinary regions and the state. So I think it's an unstoppable trend, and the important thing is to put it under legal procedures and not only leaving it to political negotiations.
Thank you, Francesco. This was just, yeah, right timing, I have to say, because it's 6:01. I have to thank you all because our time is more or less up, unless there are some burning questions or answers that we need to provide. I think I'm going to close this session or this event. Thank you all. Thank you to the authors. Thank you to Erika, who had to leave a little bit earlier. Thank you, Giuseppe. Thank you, Francesco, for joining us today, for being available to present your great edited volume, your great book that you also co-authored with other great authors that you mentioned. as well. And the last thing that I want to mention is that on June 19th, we also have another showcase event on another book related to federalism. It is not my influence, I swear, but it goes on the book on federalism and decentralization in the contemporary Middle East and North Africa. It has been edited by Ashley Bali and Omar Dayani. And two discussants that we have at that point are Vicky Jackson and Madhav Khosla. So do register and do join. And once again, thank you, Erika, thank you, Giuseppe, and thank you, Francesco, and see you hopefully very soon somewhere else, if not in Wellington in a month or so. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy.